Introduction. Perhaps all methods are good, and certainly they are good, since so many worthy men are the advocates of each of them, so long as it is remembered that man is both the object and the subject of the study. Alexander Foll. Man to man is sunshine. Jules Michelet. The most important thing is invisible to the eyes. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. The invisible birth, flaws in the culture of communication. Life is full of correspondences, some of which seem strange and inexplicable to us. They are often the most exciting, the most significant. One of the mysterious correspondences that has always excited me is that in its development, each human being repeats the history of its species, first at the biological level, and then at the socio-cultural level. At conception, the future little man in his mother's womb is first a single cell, a zygote, then it becomes a kind of multicellular colony, a fetus, and then the stem cells begin to build it and arrange it as a complex living organism. They gradually form its tissues and organs, repeating the evolution of the species. At first the embryo looks like a worm, then it acquires gills like fish, then the gills fall off and the human fetus looks like a frog, then an armadillo with a tail, a monkey with a tiny tail, until in the 9th month of pregnancy, the future baby takes on the appearance of a miniature human. When born, the human child continues the repetition of the history of his ancestors, but on another level. Until the 10th month, it is guided mainly by instincts and reflexes, like the more elementary animals. After that, his innate instincts gradually give way to a developing self-awareness during the so-called mirror period, when the child walks, talks, and begins to recognize himself and different people, creatures, and objects by the time he reaches 2 years and the foundations of his future personality have already been laid. In the period from the age of 2 to 7 years, in addition to the basis of culture as education, the child develops his speech culture, the oral model of communication, empathy, and the transmission of knowledge and skills through memorization, play and art. This is the time it lives in the world of fairy tales and myths. And with the period of socialization in pre-puberty, he builds social skills for life, in a tribe. In kindergarten and in elementary school he participates in the co-creation of the early foundations of the social self-organization of his peers, partly reminiscent of tribal egalitarianism and ancient barbarism. With this comes the time when the child learns to communicate in writing, develops skills to read and write and becomes empathetic to literature, just as his ancestors from the first civilizations developed. The learned ability to read and write in puberty opened before him the world of printed communications, of books and magazines. In addition to this, modern teenagers also absorb the latest achievements of the human communication revolutions of the 20th and 21st centuries, the handling of interactive multimedia in social networks, with visual cinematic type symbols, cinema, radio, television, computer games, the internet. Thus, the house of our individual culture of communication resembles the house of the community culture of the development and historical upgrading of the civilization to which we belong. See Figure 1. Each floor of the house of our culture of communication arose as a consequence of the development of humanity before us, reflects it in stages and corresponds to the 5 communication revolutions in the history of our ancestors: education, art, literature, ideologies, social networks.
This book aims to trace the historical development of the invisible to the eyes, our intangible cultural heritage, the soul and spiritual superworld of man. The history of the mental in us is viewed as a series of successive metamorphoses in cultures brought about by revolutions in the ways of communication between human beings and communities. In the stream of transmission of humanizing characteristics in communication in the historical evolution of cultures, significant innovative deviations periodically arise, new symbolic systems, techniques and forms of communication, giving rise to a new type of self-awareness. They create human qualities such as intelligence, morality, civility, humanity, unthinkable before the boom of breakthrough communication turns, speaking with words, written communication, video and audio media networks. The new human qualities arising from radical innovations in communication are also revolutionary in terms of human formation, anthropogenesis, when they lead to cultural transformations, of the individual, of the community and of societies. They can be metamorphoses of the entire cultural system and of the subjective mental life of the specific human personality during its cultivation. Processes of communion that transform self-awareness and cultural values occur not only in a general historical aspect, but are also repeated in our individual history, in the construction of each cultivated human personality. When, by the age of 2, the child learns to speak in words and in sentences, the same revolutionary transformation takes place with him that once in prehistory happened to the ancient hominids, who first developed verbal communication in the linguistic system of speech. In the same way, when today's students learn to read and write fluently, similar changes occur in their psyches that once occurred in the inventors of writing and literature in the first civilizations. Cultural and civilizational traditions in communication are based on the principle of building up and repeating. Radical innovations in the culture of communication, such as value exchange, grow on the basis of previous achievements, which are assimilated during the education and training of each succeeding generation. Thus, for example, both historically and at the level of individual personality construction, written communication could neither arise nor develop if it had not firmly established itself on the foundation of verbal speaking, if it had not put down its roots in the invisible system of speech, in the art of speaking. New types of communication between people, for example, reading and writing or sending photos and videos from a distance, do not replace the old ones, but change the organization of mental life in the psyche and become a prerequisite for different types of social systems and relationships. In cultural historical terms, for example, the appearance of books and letters in the first civilizations did not replace oral speech and rhetoric, but stepped on them and further developed and built upon them. The appearance of fiction did not abolish the performing arts, but arose from them and enriched them. The appearance of the cinema narrative does not replace the role of masterpiece novels in society, but popularizes them and is inspired by them. Similarly, the emergence of Buddhism did not lead to the extinction of Hinduism. The creation of Chan Buddhism in the Chinese Celestial Empire did not lead to the disappearance of Taoism and Confucianism, nor did it stop their independent development, although the new religion partially incorporated them into its own spiritual practices and value models. Likewise, in more recent times, the old religions did not disappear with the rise of modern rational and atheistic paradigms, any more than earlier Judaism did with the rise of Christianity and Islam. Even the most ancient cultural models and patterns, such as the family, animism and spiritualism, folk creativity and ethnic self-identification, belief in myths and the moral sense of oneness with the world and with others, continued to develop, together with the newly emerged, modern statehood, the print press, mass ideologies, the cosmopolitan economy and internet connectivity. The most ancient cultural phenomena that transform us, such as education, language systems, ritualism, songs and dances, belief in fabulous beings, in legendary heroes and in the associated moral feelings of union with all, continue to exist in state civilizations, and in the latest times of our planetary interconnectedness, but not statically, not as preserved, embalmed or immobilized, unchangeable fossils of the past, but as continuously evolving living processes of formation of values and symbols in our human nature. One of the starting theses of our analysis is that the history of each culture is not only the past, but also has the characteristics of a project for the future, assimilated by us in our present, in the evaluative criteria in the psyche of an individual and a community spinal level. More light on the issues under consideration can also be shed by the history of human formation, the key turning points that set the course of our development as beings who, through communication, build communities based on intangible values. The study of this issue is divided into several cores, respectively dedicated to theoretical justification for the analysis of the human superworld, revolutions of oral communication, cultural transformations of man during the revolutionary emergence and development of verbal communication in successive stages and levels, upbringing in a family, verbal speech, moral norms, communication through feelings, folklore as a collective proto-art, literary revolutions and problems of civilization, emergence of the literary type of mentality, transformation of the human personality as a result of reading and writing, print communications and media, cosmopolitanism and globalism, cinematic culture, personalities, institutions, internet communication, and social networks for causes, among which is the cause of cultural survival. Human cultures can be viewed as hypercomplex mental systems that, despite their extraordinary complexity, exhibit systemic properties, qualitative characteristics of a dynamic balance of mutually exclusive to the point of incompatibility opposites. Building on understandings characteristic of cybernetics, process philosophy, and synergism, our research specifically addresses the systemic properties of the invisible to the eye, and more specifically, to the history of human transforming living symbols of communication in a paradigmatic network with a moral evaluative context. From such a point of view, the focus of research interest are also those, often unmanifested and not always obvious, psychically cultivated over-real artifacts of articulated value dichotomies, or over-realities, potential, projective, contradictory, ambiguous and not fully realized, which as a symbolic organic system are experienced in our collective and individual communication with others, with the world and with ourselves. Logically, and also from experience, we can reasonably assume that symbol systems actively experienced as reality form sympathetic communities, humanizing the individual with new or creatively renewed human qualities, integrating value-conditioned contradictions into a dynamic unity. The peculiarities of the invisible mental and spiritual, that is, cultural, superreality, as a very strange, extraordinary form of reality, require clarification of the theoretical starting theses and the conceptual apparatus in the introductory part of the present work. As a starting approach to human knowledge, we accept the thesis argued by Hans Georg Gadamer in Truth and Method, that the sciences that deal with the human-created spiritual and mental superworld fundamentally differ from the classical sciences of nature, especially in one essential respect: studies in the humanities have no object. They cannot have an object in the first place. This is because the focus of their interest is man, and every human being is first and foremost a subject, not an object, or, to use the terminology of Spinoza's ethics, the human person is called upon to exhibit the characteristics of substance rather than matter. Every human being becomes primarily material only when it becomes a corpse, when it ceases to be a creature endowed with soul and subjective self-awareness, capable of self-renewal, self-building, and cultivation in living communion with others. If we are interested in the life in our fellows, and not in their dead corpse, then man can never become an object of study, because by nature his life is subjective and unique, and also, changeable, complete and indefinable, almost substantial. At the same time, we cannot look at our human world as an object outside of us, because it cannot be outside of us, but will always remain inside us, just as we, as long as we live, will always be inside it, to paraphrase Heidegger. Other humanities then ultimately reduce to the transmission of our cultural tradition from generation to generation, through texts akin to artistic or philosophical essays, as Gadamer claims, and if so, what distinguishes them from art? But are art and science really as different from each other as we usually think, or are there more similarities between them than we think? As Thomas Kuhn, for all above, claims, the scientific revolutions in physics since the beginning of the 20th century provide an unexpected answer to this question. The exact sciences are just as imprecise, as creative and as relative as the humanities. On the one hand, just like the human sciences, they cannot overcome the limitations of human senses, and even if they partially make progress in this respect, they will not be able to overcome the predetermination of the basic categories of the thinkable in the human mind. And in the same way, just as we cannot reason about the human world as an object that is outside of us, so we cannot correctly reason about the natural environment and the cosmos as something from which we are separate. We are nature, we are composed of nature, just as much as we are of spirituality, because our spirituality itself is naturally conditioned. We are an inseparable part of this universe and it is a part of us, we have grown with it and we cannot look at it as bystanders. And for an object to be something, it must first of all be material, divisible and definable, but neither nature nor the universe are primarily material, nor are they divisible or definable. They are primarily dynamic processes, functions and relations, movements, energy, synergy, physiology of constantly changing development and of unique, unrepeatable cases. That is why the correct knowledge of them must first of all take into account their indeterminacy, indivisibility, probability and potentiality, dynamism, changeability, processuality, chaoticity or paradoxicality, as well as the synergy of their relations. The discoveries about us, of unknowability in knowledge, as a different point of view for awareness of the real, set forth in the new scientific paradigms from the theory of relativity to cybernetics, do not actually limit scientific thinking, but make it more accurate, more correct, more multi-layered, more sensitive to the nature of the world, larger and more creative. Scientific pioneers and revolutionaries in thought patterns, such as Bohr, Einstein, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, Ramanujan, Whitehead, Russell, Kuhn, Sagan, and Hawking, discover for scientific pursuit the dynamic, shadow half of reality, which until now has not been was the object of research, whole new worlds, those of the probable and the unrealized, of the potentially possible and the processes of its creation, of the relations between the forces and the regularities that make them relative to each other, and also of the disordered, the accidental and the unique, of what happened only once, which can never be repeated, of the indivisible and of interaction, of the paradoxical and of the unknowable, of the supercomplex and of the innumerable, the qualitative. It goes without saying that all these unexplored until a century ago qualities of reality, which were initially discovered in relation to the strange attractions of elementary particles in quantum physics, and macrocosmic phenomena in astrophysics, and were subsequently applied to other chaotic states and for other complex systems, in climatology, in physico-biochemistry, in biology, in ecology, in medicine, in mathematics and in linguistics, to the greatest extent actually refer to the human, cultural and mental, soulful and spiritual, collective superworld.
Dynamically, human truth depends on time because it is born in history. Something today may be half-truth and become true tomorrow. Another may have been true yesterday, and may no longer be true today. Because the human truths in the communication that transforms us are valuable super-truths, not sense-conditioned categories. However, it would be a great mistake if we underestimated the influence of these immaterial, or mental, value truths on the material and bodily aspects of our being and our development. If we delve into the history of cultures and civilizations, we will find that they often predetermine them. This research seeks to justify the value aspect of the inaccuracy of the humanities by demonstrating how complexity theory can work analytically, how it can correctly handle the inaccuracy of unfulfilled dreams and ideals of overvalued, moral metaphysical, substantial, self-sufficient projects that arose in the development of human communication. In order to be able to proceed to a concrete analysis of the complexity of such semi-existent quantum and paradoxical cultural phenomena as humanity, dreams, plans for life, value systems, fantastic beings and fantastic beliefs, moral evaluative feelings, the artistic word, poetic inspiration, which are part of the innermost contents of interpersonal communication, giving rise to transformations in our soul and spiritual superworld, it will be necessary to first present and justify our research paradigm in detail with its entire logic, methodology and conceptual apparatus. This is also necessary because, observing the invisible and underrealized aspects in the human psychically cultivated world, we are actually dealing not with ordinary objects or objects, but with an all-encompassing collective subjectivity, sometimes with qualities and of substantiality, which in its organic totality does not yield of dismemberment, because it is by its nature indivisible, inseparable systematicity, nor of strict classification, but only conditional, which is unfathomably complex, which is inherently paradoxical, like any complex system, to which we ourselves naturally and inseparably belong, because we ourselves are organisms of the same socio-cultural super-ecosystem we explore, and which is impermanent and ever-changing because it is not a completion but is in the process of being accomplished. And this is so, because the soul and spiritual values exchanged between us, on which the human creating and community creating transformations in our communication with others depend, are rather potentialities, latent possibilities for future realization, and are not finally realized facts or actions. And yet it is they who create and build our human superworld. And he is not incorporeal, but supercorporeal. It is not above biology and above the biosphere, but it is biocultural and therefore suprabiological or supraecological. The soul and spiritual psychic cultivated collective subjective cosmos, though often unseen and always underrealized, is not non-physical, nor is it supraphysical or metaphysical, but is supraphysical. It is not speculative, but is embodied in concrete actions, behavior and activity,
often with a drastic impact on our peers and on our living environment, and at the same time it is not entirely immaterial, because in our development we have achieved the property of being good with materials and with matter drawn from the environment, to objectify into things and into machines, and also into machines of mass destruction, our invisible dreams and images of our imagination. And last but not least, the hyperreality generated by our communication in a cultural context predetermines our view of the world, because it is the world in which we live, our only accessible world, both at the level of our mentality, of our value orientations, of our manners, of our language and speech, of our thoughts, and of our ethical and aesthetic judgments through complex cultivated feelings, as well as of our overall self-consciousness, and of our very sense perception of reality. After all, our human superreality is our reality. Soulful and spiritual, psychically cultivated and creating communities through communion, it is also our only reality, the only possible and accessible one for empathy and perception. We don't actually have any other reality than this, the human one, the one that is called by its nature to be also human creating.
In its human creating aspect, the differences between scientific and artistic poetic knowledge, and especially between the sciences of nature, the so-called exact sciences, which, however, already a century ago proved their original, basic inaccuracy, and the sciences of man, with its societies and culture should be seen as insubstantial because they turn out to be conditional, uncertain, and fuzzy, as Thomas Kuhn also reveals. Authors such as Edgar Morin and his collaborators, and followers, go one step further, not only noting the fading of the boundaries in question, but also actively crossing them themselves with the audacity to create a new comprehensive human natural science, again, ab ovo, from the very beginnings and from the very beginning, within the framework of the transdisciplinary method for the study of complexity and the theory justifying it. By the way, the transdisciplinary paradigm for the complexity of reality can rather conditionally be called new, since it exists and has been developing in the fundamental sciences for more than 100 years, and in the works of established classical authors, starting from Einstein and up to Hawking, and starting with Rachel Carson, Denis de Rougemont and Donella Meadows, and up to modern empirical studies of cultural values, such as Geert Hofstede's large-scale annual global local survey, and such as the study of the effect of small world in planetary multimedia social networks, such as that of mathematician transdisciplinary Duncan Watts. In an even broader historical plan, the newness of transdisciplinarity as a paradigm looks like a revival of the forgotten old, characteristic of classical philosophy. Starting from Plato and reaching Kant, it is not by chance that the creator of procedural philosophy, the innovative mathematician Albert Whitehead, defines himself as a Platonist, and so did Sigmund Freud in his late works, from Spinoza to Hannah Arendt, or from the unity and struggle of opposites of Hegel and Marx and Engels to the original social Freudianism of Jean Baudrillard. And the same applies to names that have become classics in the field of psychology, such as Jung, Lacan, Fromm and Maslow, as well as for those in social and cultural and historical anthropology, such as Claude Lévi-Strauss, Fernand Braudel and Clifford Geertz. This suggests that the real contemporary watershed between scientific paradigms may no longer be between the humanities and the exact sciences, nor between the natural sciences and the human sciences, but is actually between basic and applied science, in which case this watershed is about to become an abyss as well, because the gap between their two diametrically opposed points of view fails to find a reconciliatory balance, and the war between them escalates more and threatens to turn the applied sciences into a new holy inquisition, anathemas, and suppresses any attempt to fundamental research suggesting a creative flight of imagination. In this regard, so that there are no misunderstandings, we must emphasize that the research we present is in the field of the philosophy of culture, and this makes it automatically and transdisciplinary and situates it in the tradition of fundamental science at its core. This is not applied research, and it cannot be expected that it will have the character of applied research, nor that it will fit within the framework and criteria of scientificity, or rather in the Procrustean bed of the applied type of science. Nevertheless, regardless of whether we perceive the research paradigm of transdisciplinary reasoning and analysis about the complexity, and about the paradoxical superorganic systematicity of cultural, mental and spiritual phenomena as radically new, or as the revived forgotten old form of thinking, of the classical philosophers, in any case the detailed logical and theoretical justification of the nature of both the starting theses and the conceptual apparatus of the proposed research approach is clearly necessary. For this purpose, in the introductory first part of the text, we will present argumentation of the preferred conceptual apparatus and the semantic frameworks of the proposed key terms that we will deal with, some of which are borrowed from authors such as Jung, Lacan, and Morin, while others are to some extent original. The most general characteristics of the transdisciplinary method for the study of complex phenomena, and specific features of applications in the analysis transdisciplinary method, you combine in one whole socio-cultural, historical geographical, humanitarian critical, and moral philosophical, systemic ecological, artistic creative and artistic, historical and psychological traditions of thought. Specific nature of biocultural ecosystems that characterize the nature of human beings and communities. Axiological features of complex organic systematicity, dichotomies and balances in cultural systems and in communication. Features of human interpersonal and group communication with living symbols in a cultural context that forms communities. Aspects of complexity, quantum logic in the psychically cultivated human soul and spiritual superworld. Probabilities, indeterminacy, processuality, potencies, contingencies, variability, indivisibility, paradoxicality. Justification and explanation of the concept of superreality, as a characteristic of the paradigms of the psychic spiritual world, a holistic unity of real, imaginary, and symbolic, forming the sphere of human activity as a planetary anthroposphere. Keys to communication in a valuable cultural context, empathy, catharsis, questioning the other, translation and understanding. Layered upgrading of what was inherited from revolutions in communication, which led to cultural transformations that are also human-forming, revolutions of oral communication, education family, art people, and of reading, literature civilization, media ideologies, networks of personalities, questions about the future of cultural traditions related to our humanization. Final summary, what is our invisible cultural heritage? From a complex, transdisciplinary perspective, the meaning of the study of the past, invisible to the eyes, is not historiographical. Rather, it is related to the question of the future of man, to the great problems and challenges of the present, to our chances of survival and development as full-fledged human beings. Therefore, the emphasis on the issues under consideration also affects the great question of human knowledge. What is man actually? Is it possible to understand him at all, and with what key? What distinguishes human reality from other levels of reality?
Meaning and objectives of this book. I am often asked the question of what is the meaning of this book and why I am writing it as it is. This question is asked by both acquaintances and friends, as well as those closest to me, and sometimes I ask it myself. It contains several aspects. Why write anything at all, unless it will help me for career development, for public prestige, for more material security and for a higher salary? Fundamental questions are also what is the point of writing at all nowadays, especially humanitarian science, who will read it anyway and what will the reading give them? I will try to personally answer these questions from the beginning. To a great extent, the difficulty and volume of this text seem indeed to render its existence meaningless, and to render in vain the many years, time, and effort with which I have been engaged in it. And yet, to me, it's always meaningful to write something that you experience as meaningful, and as potentially meaningful to other people. The possibility that at least one person will read it and be enriched or moved by it is in itself reason enough to make sense of publishing something that would otherwise be irretrievably lost with the physical death of the author. My interest in the intimate and collective intrapsychic experience of superreal, soulful and spiritual, cultural values, such as religious ones, deepened and expanded into the realm of interreligious dialogue. In this regard, I continued my field work in the Central and Eastern Rhodopes in the study of communication between Christian believers and Muslims in a 4-year project supported by the Scientific Research Fund of the Ministry of Education and Science and by the Directorate of Religions, which we implemented in a team with colleagues, specialists according to Islam. In the meantime, I also participated in global forums for interreligious dialogue held by the International Whitehead Society for Process Philosophical Studies, of which I am a member. My interest in procedural, synergistic and ecological philosophy has also increased due to my social experience as a social activist, a participant in the Bulgarian nature protection movement and co-initiator, co-creator and co-coordinator of a civil association and the transdisciplinary educational network built by it for practices of sustainable development, a place for the future, which over the years has grown into an international one, during the annually organized traveling inter and transdisciplinary universities in Western Stara Planina, with many partners and diverse participants. My activity as a co-initiator and coordinator of the educational network was the reason why I also started my career as a university teacher. Working with students allowed me to collect and process significant lecture material, which gradually began to take shape as a complete connected narrative of human cultural history, read through the angle of new scientific paradigms, theory of complexity, proceduralism, uncertainty, chaos, and invariance, of value selectivity, of systemism and synergism, of biological, social and cultural ecosystems creating the anthroposphere, the sphere of human activity at the planetary level. In this context, in the course of teaching, in search of forms of how to explain comprehensibly and the most difficult to understand, without at the same time simplifying or secularizing it, my personal, original hypotheses, methodology and ideas regarding with the diverse issues under consideration, which gradually began to take the form of more in-depth empirical analyses and theoretical concepts. This is how this book came about, as a summarizing organic union of all my scientific and non-scientific interests so far, as well as my acquired knowledge and experience. I wrote this text also as an experiment to present them in an interconnected, complex and transdisciplinary unity, in a kind of overall, big story, about the human-forming qualities that we inherited and still inherit from our past and on which the processes of humanization probably depend us in the future, and also whether we will have prospects for the future at all.
Research objectives and limitations. Research tasks. Scientifically, my work with the method of biographical interviews aroused my interest in the dream level of the self-awareness of the person and highlighted the need to more clearly substantiate the theory of the hidden and intimate in the person, including also the mystical and transcendent experience, the personal experience of faith and religion. In this context, I began to be interested in the problems of how collective experiences of magical or miraculous living symbols are formed. For example, the collective visions of all believers of St. George, miraculous healing from childlessness or other diseases. Thus, my interest also turned to the questions of how we empathize actively, in conscience alive in our self-awareness. Symbolic images from fairy tales, legends, myths, moral philosophical and fiction literature, especially those that form value codes and a context of communication between us. Theoretically, my experience has been enriched by the knowledge gained from discussions, debates, scientific forums, conversations with colleagues and with specialists and with social activists from a variety of fields, as well as by my own reflections when trying to form a summarizing narrative text in my lectures and in my research articles and analyses. My visions of ethics, of morality, of values, of communities, of nature and of man, and of man's nature, began to take on specific characteristics, and a more and more holistic interconnected appearance with a set of more particular concepts and understandings that became more and more difficult to explain and increasingly not self-evident. I had to introduce and explain them in each of my scientific texts, which took away from my space for analysis. So at some point I realized that it would be good to have a separate text just on the theoretical concepts, methods and frameworks I work with, so that I can refer to it in scientific analyses without having to reconstruct each time in each article the theoretical framework of my understanding. I started writing this book with such an intention that it represents an argumentation of my theoretical views, which I have acquired over the course of tens of years of reflection on the acquired knowledge and experience from various spheres related to the human world and, more specifically, to the communication that forms natural communities, based on symbolically shared common values that give rise to a commonly understood socio-cultural context. This would allow in future analyses to refer to a thoroughly argued and illustrated with numerous examples theoretical type of work in connection with the hypotheses and specific concepts used by different authors in different fields regarding the superworld of man. I find that without creative hypotheses one does not and never has done science at all. In this regard, it would be good if every scientist had a little or more insight into the writings of Thomas Kuhn. The facts change every year with the development of science and its methods, including those of our history and prehistory. Any dogmatic claim to definitively discovered truth is scholasticism, not science. And as for the humanities, the same cannot be demanded from them as from the technical sciences, because they are of a completely different nature and have completely different theses. And they also have different tasks and goals, including public ones. Also, the artifacts they handle have a particular nature, not clear enough, variable and subjective, and too complex. And so it's difficult and complex if you want to look at the broader scale of qualitative characteristics other than simple description, and ethnographer-style enumeration. Cultural anthropology in this regard is a particularly uncertain field, more so than quantum physics, especially when it includes elements of historical reconstruction. However, this does not mean that it does not make sense and should not be developed, just because it is incipient. What can and should be required of humanitarian studies is not to lie openly, not to contradict and not to replace currently established facts. But if something cannot be proven to be untrue, it can be stated as a hypothesis, including in the exact and natural sciences, as long as it is explicitly stated as a conjecture rather than an established fact. And sometimes, in the end, those unproven and/or unprovable hypotheses and ideas that have a greater value for a person than simple factology, changeable and short-term, remain as significant in the end.
The book I have been working on for more than 10 years is full of conjecture, because that is the nature of its subject matter. There is no way to ask those who died centuries or millennia ago how they lived and what they thought and felt, what they dreamed and what they fantasized about, and if we ask contemporaries this, then we have no way to find out whether they are not lying to us or whether they are not lying to themselves. There is some techniques, but not enough for complete security. The difficult task I have set myself in this text is related to my conviction that the inexplicable can still be explained without ceasing to be inexplicable. One can rationally argue why it is inexplicable, in which aspects it is inexplicable, and in what will always remain unexplained, and why. I find this necessary to bridge the dissociating rift between our thoughts and our feelings, between the intuitive and the empirical. I strive for abstract words to cease to be abstract for those who read carefully, for example, by translating them into Bulgarian, or presenting them with a set of synonyms, explaining their meaning logically, or illustrating them with concrete examples from life. For example, the abstract epithet, spiritual and spiritual, which I introduce as an explanatory term for certain characteristics of human life, for me is roughly synonymous with mental and cultural. Spiritual equals mental, translated from Greek. Cultural means ennobled in translation from Latin, and in our language the expression, spiritual sphere, is generally synonymous with cultural sphere. As another explanatory translation of the same epithet, I have used the expression mentally cultivated, i.e. built, nurtured, ennobled, and spiritualized, elevated equals, sublimated, through the psyche, not through anything else, be it body, DNA, or state laws. And this means that cultivation as a transformation occurs in the mental life, or inner peace of mind, of the particular person, in the context of his community with others. The level of the soulful and spiritual, or mental cultivated, in us gives rise to that superworld of human communities, the human superworld. In this case I use the particle over to emphasize that this is a world that is also physical, but not only, and exists, but not only, and is realized, but not only. Therefore, not only, by analogy I characterize the human soul and spiritual superworld, and with the metaphor, quantum. This means that in this superworld many things have not been realized, not yet, or will not be at all, because it is a world and of dreams and projects for the future. Some of these dreams of ours have already come true, others have not come true at all, and there is still more to come to be realized, while others are only dreams, unrelated to goals and tasks, not leading to concrete activity. But most of them are in process, they have been implemented and are being implemented, but only partially and only to some extent. The activity of their development is yet to come. In other words, these processes can also be defined as living, that is, those that develop and evolve. So, for example, our mental and spiritual that is, mentally cultivated, activity, riding a bicycle, goes through the following stages: dream of being able to ride a bicycle, learning to ride a bicycle, perfecting riding a bicycle. At each stage of this process, cycling is not fully accomplished, it is cycling, but not quite, because it is not definitively finished as a possibility for realization. There is still room for development. Only when the cyclist dies, only then does riding a bicycle become completely complete, deterministic, because it cannot continue as far as you learn to ride there, and that's it. Because the end is coming, but even the end is not quite, because in the meantime you have taught or inspired others to ride a bicycle, and they continue your biking after you, and instead of you. What this means to me is that riding a bicycle is a hyperreal phenomenon. That is, it is real, but it is also more than real, because besides having achieved it somewhat, it always includes dreams of riding better, more joyfully, better, more magical, and also plans and projects how to make driving even better, leading to processes of learning and development and improvement of this activity, as well as a potential opportunity to drive even better, well, or even more differently than anyone has done before. That is why for me riding a bicycle is a psychically cultivated hyperreality. It is real, but not only and not completely, because it can still be improved, due to the peculiarities of our inner, personal, soul life, and because of its refinement over generations, within the framework of our spiritual, that is, cultural, tradition. The way in which this very special, semi-existent and almost existent, characteristic of human activity is carried out, the creation of an always unfinished superworld, including its invisible levels, those that remain only potential, inside the soul, in the thoughts, in the feelings, in the dreams, in the head and in the heart, and in our action, is communicating with oneself, with others and with the world. And the sphere they create in our environment is the planetary anthroposphere, the sphere of human activity on our planet.